Let me share my screen. Okay, here we go. So, can you see the slide?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, excellent. So, yes, today I would like to talk to you about why routing security is important and what are the challenges. Why can't we sort out this problem for several decades already? And hopefully to convince you that the only way to solve this is to work together collectively and clean up our side of the street. And that's what MANRS is about. So as Maria Isabel said, I mean, if you have questions, we have informal meeting here. Please type it in the chat, and Maria Isabel will monitor the chat, and we can discuss this when questions come up. So now, we all know the internet wasn't designed as a secure network. And maybe that's one of the reasons of its success, because it was so easy to set up, so easy to connect. The only requirement for you to connect to the internet was adherence to the IP standard, IP protocol. So the objective of the network was resilience, simplicity, and ease of deployment. And that's why it grew so enormously fast and supports such an enormous range of applications. But as it sort of penetrated in our sort of life in the societal good, the requirements for security became more and more important. Well, I don't have to explain you how routing works, of course, but this is just a recap that we have almost 70,000 independent networks, each of them making their own decisions and implementing their own policy. Each of those 70,000 networks, because of the insecurity of BGP protocol, can, in theory, raise havoc in the routing system. And we saw on many occasions how a small network, even an edge network, can create a multi-hour outage for that spans globally. And that's because of the flexibility, the centralized routing system, which are the benefits, but also have a downside because not enough security controls are implemented. Much of how we work and how we exchange routing information is based on trust, and that trust needs to be supported by some other means. So there is a great service which is called bgpstream.com, and basically it's sort of a live stream of potential incidents that happen in the routing system by observing routing tables from different vantage points. And I looked at the data. I actually did this for a couple of years, starting with 2017, but I looked specifically in 2019. And yes, I think we all agree that there is a problem. There are about 10,000 total incidents, either outages or attacks, of which about 40% are real routing security incidents. Whether that malicious attacks or just misconfigurations, it's hard to say. I mean, intent is very difficult to understand from looking at this data, but that's probably beyond the point. Either it's malice or misconfiguration, it creates outages, it requires troubleshooting, and usually involves more than just one network. So 2.5% of all networks were affected by an outage, which is a relatively high number, I would say. And 4% of all networks were affected by a routing incident. And 2% of networks were responsible for all routing incidents. It doesn't mean that these two need to fix things. I think many more networks need to fix things. It's just those two were culprits in 2019. And by the way, how routing incidents spread globally, we can say that not many controls preventing this incident spreading. So more work needs to be done. So let's look at sort of a few types of routing incidents that are well known, and probably that is sort of a simplified diagram that you all know. And first incident that is commonly happening is route hijacking, when a network impersonates another network, either impersonates by itself or pretends that the victim network is a customer of the attacker. And I will call attacker in a more general sense, right? It doesn't mean that that's necessarily a malicious attack. It's just attack in the sense of the outcome, right? Even if it's misconfiguration. So in this particular case, if autonomous system X starts to announce a particular prefix belonging to another customer on the internet, part of the internet will believe that that's the correct route if they don't have enough controls. If, for instance, transit provider ASB doesn't have those controls and propagates this route to the global internet. And the further you from the sort of, the origin of these networks, usually less checks, less stringent you are on checking this stuff. So really closer to the edge is where controls should be. Now, one of the sort of classic attack of this type was YouTube incident, when Pakistan Telecom, for different reasons, start announcing YouTube prefix. And so what happened is that their transit provider, ASB, which was at that time PCCW, announced this to the great internet, and more than half of the internet believed that, because that, as you know, I mean, if you don't have enough controls, best path probably wins, and that was probably the best path for many of the networks of the internet. And as a result, YouTube was disconnected, not available for a big deal of the internet for about 2 hours. That's also another thing that I will stress later, but this highlights that YouTube could have done only so much to protect themselves from this attack. It was actually Pakistan Telecom and their upstream provider PCCW who could have protected YouTube. And in fact, they protected YouTube because PCCW ultimately dropped this announcement and therefore prevented this incident from, stopped this incident. Another more subtle attack, but I think because it's more subtle, it's more dangerous. And if it's a misconfiguration mistake, it also creates a lot of mess in the routing, is what is called route leak. And basically, route leak is not per se a BGP violation. It's actually a policy violation, because a common policy, for instance, in a customer-provider relationship is that customer announces to their provider only customer links, right? And provider prefers those routes to routes, maybe alternative routes they learned from other sources like their peers or their upstream provider. And that makes sense, of course, from purely if you look just at cost and connectivity, that of course the best route to your customer should come from your customer. But sometimes customer learns other routes, not only about their network or about their customers, but also about routes they learn from another transit provider if they're multi-home. And what happens if this customer all of a sudden announces to another transit provider these routes? For instance, a route to Google, well, in this particular example. And what happens if the second provider doesn't have enough controls in place and believes the customer, and therefore thinks that Google is best reachable through their customer? That is what happens, and that's what's called route leak. In this particular case, in most cases, and especially if you announce routes to big content providers or where a lot of traffic is going, so this multi-home customer becomes a transit provider for IS-64 and probably will be overwhelmed with traffic that is sent to them, which will create a lot of outage. But for all the customers of IS-64 500, Google will not be available. until this incident is resolved. And well, for instance, another example is June 2019, when an American network leak routes from another provider to Verizon, causing a very significant outage globally, because Verizon is, of course, a very big network. And that underpins the fact that even a small network, even an edge network, can create a lot of mess in the routing system. Well, I put IP address spoofing for completeness, and partly because it's also part of MANRS recommendations. Now, source IP address spoofing, it's not per se routing, right? It is related to routing because routing in the internet doesn't care about the source IP address. It doesn't care, forwarding, let's put it that way. It doesn't care where packet came from. It only looks at the destination. Well, like a postal office as well, right? Only if there is a problem with this packet, then the source IP address will look up, or when packet reaches the destination that requires a reply, then the source IP address will be relevant. And that is used in what is called reflection and amplification attacks, when an attacker substitutes their own source IP address with the IP address of the victim. And they use an amplifier, and a very common amplifier is an open resolver, DNS resolver. So DNS resolver accepts small questions and replies with much bigger answers. So that's amplification. It also replies to a source IP address, and if IP address is spoofed, that's a reflection. So basically, you amplify and reflect all this traffic to the victim. Victim gets overwhelmed, and that's a denial of service attack. And because it can be fixed on the routing layer, because it can be, routing system can be used to mitigate this type of attack, anti-spoofing action or recommendations are included in MANRS, and that's why I include this type of attack in this presentation. Okay, so well, I showed you some theoretical things, of course, but as you know, there are many real life examples that hit headlines, and many more. I showed you about 10,000 incidents. Not all of them were as devastating as the ones I provide on this slide, but still many of them were just not hitting the headlines, not reaching the media outlets. And as you probably know, routing security incidents are very hard to troubleshoot because they can disguise as just loss of connectivity, an outage, or just poor performance. And sometimes before you get to the origin of what's happening, this announcement is gone and system is functioning as before. So they are hard to detect, hard to troubleshoot, but they may cause a lot of problems. So let me pause and ask this question. So, okay, we understand that's a problem, right? But why routing security is so hard? Why, since sort of basically since inception of BGP, we're trying to solve those problems. Back in 2006, there was a great RFC published by the IETF that documented all security problems related to internet routing and BGP. And there are already, as you know, solutions, and we had practices and solutions before that could have prevented or mitigated, if not solved, this problem completely. So, of course, each player can contribute to routing security by implementing those controls. But also each player, each of those 70,000 networks can be a cause of incident. So it's high probability, even if it's fat fingers, what we call sort of misconfigurations, configuration mistakes, that, well, something sort of mistyped, and that can spread globally. Most of networks, and I mean, look at yourself, of course you would like to have a more secure routing system, because that means less troubleshooting, more stability, more resilience. Because routing incidents are hard to debug and fix. because it takes time of your help desk. But most of the networks, they have little incentive. So I showed on the slide 4% of networks were affected, right? It's like, well, what's the probability I'm going to be affected? Not really. But also, security controls I implement, they are actually not really securing my network. They help improve the overall security of the routing system, but they do not contribute to my own security that much. I mean, back to what I said when we discussed the routing security incident that hit YouTube. Well, there are some mitigation techniques. For instance, you can start announcing more specific routes or something like this. But ultimately, that's up to other operators to fix your routing or this misconfiguration by Pakistan Telecom, for instance. So if you look at this way, then security of your network is in the hands of other operators, your competitors as well. So this situation is commonly called in social science as a collective action problem. That we know we have common goal, we know how the good looks like, but because of conflicting interests, lack of business case, we're unable to all move in this direction and solve that problem. So when routing security is discussed, sometimes regulation pops up and people say, well, maybe a regulator needs to step up, and some governments were thinking maybe we should step up and mandate something and that will solve routing security. But regulation of the global network and global routing system is a bit pointless on a national level, right? Because an incident like, well, case in point again, YouTube incident, even if you regulate and you enforce hygiene in the United States for YouTube and their peers, Pakistan Telecom can still not abide to those rules. So regulation, effective regulation is very hard, but also regulation cannot keep up with the changes, with the sort of agility of the network. It can actually impede this agility. There is another solution that proved to be effective in those type of situations, and that's the norms, right? Well, we all know norms in social life and social behavior, and those are also norms, right? So what is needed for norms? We need to agree on values and we need to agree on behaviors, right? An agreement is just common understanding, right? You wash hands, you greet people when you meet, this kind of stuff. So do we have a common value? I think we do. I think we all agree that resilient and secure global routing system is a common good. It's something we should strive for. And do we know what kind of behaviors we need to follow in order to achieve that? Yes. I mean, those practices were there around for decades, as I said, and new technologies now standardized by the IETF are also ready for deployment. So do not accept and propagate other mistakes, right? Check browse that you receive from your peers and protect your neighbors from your own mistakes. So install additional controls, ensuring that only routes you intend or you should announce, they go outside your network. So do not hijack, do not leak, and enable others to validate. So one thing I didn't mention, but you of course know that BGP, because it doesn't have an intrinsic way of validating those announcements, we have to retreat to other sources of information. And so far, the most common was Internet Routing Registry, but now RPKI, I think, takes off, and raw repositories are another source of this information. Check legitimacy of this announcement. Does this prefix announcement come from the valid, authenticated space, authorized space as well? So how can we move from behaviors to norms? Well, to behaviors become a norm, they should be, of course, widely accepted as a good practice. And maybe as a follow-up or as a prerequisite for that, that can be very high requirements where only few can implement. It should be pretty, well, relatively easy that anyone in principle with some, intention and motivation can implement this practice. So they cannot be just the current state if we want to move to a new normal, but they should be just one step above, not the best possible outcome. And those norms should be visible and measurable. So why I'm telling you all this, which is per se doesn't relate to routing? Well, I'm telling you because mutually agreed norms for routing security is based on this concept. And norms here in this title are not for nothing. In fact, what MANRS is trying to achieve is to create new norms of routing operations. When not adhering to those norms are socially unacceptable, right? When you pay on internet exchange and you do not adhere to those norms, you don't put these controls in place, your peers will say, not sure you're doing the right thing. Maybe you need to clean up your backyard before you connect to our internet exchange, for instance. Or when I connect my customer, I would say, well, look, I mean, you need to install those controls, and there are practices that document how you can do that. So what MANRS is about, it's a baseline, right? A baseline recommendations, very simple things. It's not a best current practice. It is distilled from best current practices, but that's what the sort of middle step that I was telling you. We just need to raise the bar a bit higher, still achieve great improvements routing security, but not too high, not to solve all the problem at once, because then only few can be able to join and promote this. And we need majority to be able to do that. And also to the question of visibility and wide acceptance, we need to demonstrate this by visible community of security-minded operators. And that's MANRS is not only a recommendation, it's also the MANRS community that when people join, they take some substantive activities and they promote MANRS in their environment. So let's talk about sort of the internals of MANRS inside. So MANRS is not a monolith. We actually looked at who can make an impact in the routing system. And there are different categories of, well, network operators in general term, right, that can make this impact. It's enterprise and access networks. And as I said, even edge networks can create problems, right? So if they clean up their stuff, and it's relatively easy for them to clean this up because they exactly know what they are going to announce, then it will be a great improvement as well. But there are too many of them. You know that maybe 84% of this 70,000 networks are origin only. They're edge networks. So pretty high number. There are also transit providers. That's a much lower number, right? If we look, it's about maybe 9,000 networks globally. So they can be a next line of defense, right? That can control if announcements from their customers are okay, legitimate, and therefore prevent mistakes from propagating. The internet exchange points, and we'll talk about this in more detail, very important because they interconnect many networks. And last but not least, CDN and Cloud providers, which may look like edge networks, but they're very big networks, and they have a lot of peering power because many networks would like to peer with them. Let me pause here. Marie Isabel, I see some sort of blimps. I wonder if there are any questions or comments in the chat that it would be a good point to respond.
Not yet. I put a comment in the chat saying if anyone wanted to ask. Is anyone willing to ask anything? Well, let's wait till the end then. Or if anyone wants to jump in and ask, please do it.
Okay, then let's continue. So we launched this initiative, and when I say we, ISOC is a supporting partner. You can think of ISOC, Internet Society, as a secretariat of MANRS. But in fact, MANRS was launched by a group of network operators that came together and pondered how this routing problem can be solved more effectively. and came up with this proposal. So network operators were the first group that MANRS tackled. And it was launched with 4 actions I can go over in a bit that required operators to implement if they want to join this effort. So that's another distinction of MANRS from other maybe sort of declarations or manifestations, is that you're not declaring that you support routing security or you think routing security is important. You actually demonstrate this by committing to certain actions and demonstrating that you implement certain controls. And those controls are preventing propagation of incorrect routing information. And because this is not the best current practice, it is limited to your customers. So it's relatively easy to implement. We are not talking about validating this globally. Anti-spoofing, prevent traffic with spoofed source IP addresses. And again, there are narrowed circumstances where this requirement is really strict, because we know that in some topologies, sort of anti-spoofing measures like URPF can create problems, can cut off your customers. So anti-spoofing in this case is applicable to customers that are single home stop customers, which again, it's very easy to implement this action. Coordination, that's a very easy action. It actually says that you have to have your contacts open, responsive. So if others experience a problem and need your help, they can contact you. And while this action is very simple, it's at the same time very, very important, because those incidents, they span the globe, right? And you need to reach out maybe another part of the globe or the continent to get help, to say, hey, could you stop this announcement? So being able to contact other network operators quickly and effectively is super important. And finally, and the title is slightly misleading here, it talks about global validation, although no validation is required at this stage. What is required is that you publish your intention, the prefixes that you intend to announce or others should expect from you in common repositories. And at the moment, the common repositories are Internet Routing Registries or RPKI system. And we talked about that. To validate, you need to retreat to other sources of information. So if others would like to validate the announcements more globally, they can do this because your routes are registered there. Oops, skipped over. So once we start and MANRS took off and a number of network operators, ISPs, grew up, we're thinking, how can we scale this up? How can we reach this 70,000 or a number maybe closer to that? Can we just do this, continuing this way? And the answer was no. We need partners in this game, and partners that can also contribute to routing security. And Internet exchange points were a very obvious and natural partner to MANRS, because IXPs form communities with common operation objective, right? If not for CATNIX, we would not have this meeting today, right? So it unites you because you want to exchange traffic among yourselves. You have this local community, and local communities are very important. That's where peer pressure is, right? Peer pressure globally doesn't really work. And MANRS can be useful to your community, for instance, as a common global reference point, right? What is missing is not that we sort of not taking enough attention to routing security, but we don't have a clear common plan, coherent plan to solve that problem. And because in routing, any network can become a weak link, it's important that we go wide rather than deep. Rather than implement all possible controls in one network, we should implement, at least improve routing controls in almost all networks in the internet, right? So with this in mind, a task force was formed of IXPs that developed a set of actions. Again, this is a community-driven effort, so IXPs discussed this with their communities as well and came up with actions how they can sensibly contribute to routing security. And there were 5 actions, and 2 of them are most important. I'll talk a little bit more about those 2. The first one is, again, prevent propagation of incorrect routing information. And, well, many IXPs, including CATNIX, they have a tool for multilateral peering, which is called the route server. And that's an excellent point where you can implement controls for routing security. So if route server accepts only legitimate route for its members, then routing incidents do not propagate in peering environment. So that's the first action. And the second action, because IXPs are seen as partners, right? Like here, that you invited me, that's great, right? Because CATNIX is partner, because CATNIX is MANRS member, then promote MANRS to IXP membership is very important. And this IXP program was launched in April 2018, it grew. Now we have 55 IXPs, and I think your Internet Exchange Point joined very shortly after the launch. I think in autumn the same year, 2018, if not mistaken, and we're very grateful for that. Well done.
Thank you.
And then sort of, program continued, but we was thinking, what are the best ways to improve scalability of this effort? And we looked at another player that I listed before, which is CDN and Cloud providers. So what is special about CDNs and cloud providers? Well, the most special thing that they are, although looking like edge, they are very big networks. They're very powerful networks.
Sorry, it seems someone connected just now and it was not mute.
Okay, all right.
Sorry.
No problem at all. So they're very important networks. They're important for other networks because they provide information and services. And this information and services, to achieve higher performance, people would like to peer as close to them as possible, right? Hopefully directly peer with those providers. So we were discussing with CDN and cloud providers and saying, hey, would it be possible to leverage your peering power and somehow, motivate your peers, your customers, to implement better routing practices? So create, secure peering environment for yourself. That's a win for you, but also to motivate others to implement those controls. That's a win for the community. And again, we formed a task force. So this idea sort of, passed the laugh test, and we create task force. And that's the task force. I'm listing it here because it's the most recent program that we launched this year in March this year. So that's very fresh in our minds. We went off. These people discussed the potential actions CDN and Cloud providers can implement. It came up with 6 actions, 5 of them mandatory. So I forgot to mention this, that blue rectangles that I put on slides are mandatory actions. So here I would touch on, many actions are similar to what we see in other categories, but I would like to touch on action 1 and action 5, because that's, from MANRS perspective, that's the most important actions we expect from CDN and Cloud. Well, first is prevent propagation and routing information, both ingress and egress. So you control what you emit to the internet. That's sort of understood, common practice. A more difficult one is to require your peers to implement those routing controls. And how can you motivate them to do this? You say, we are not accepting routes if they are not, for instance, registered in routing registry, or they're not registered through our portal, or they're not registered in RPKS system. That's the best way, by the way. So therefore, they really encourage MANRS adoption outside their network. And because they have a huge peering base, that scales up MANRS really. But plus, they're not just saying, hey, implement those controls, but they say, implement other controls as well that are in the MANRS recommendations. So that really encouraging MANRS adoption. And why is that? Well, because that's also win-win for CDN and clouds, because as you know, even if illegitimate route doesn't propagate on direct peering, it can still reach CDN and cloud provider through their transit service, for instance, right? So if network is really implementing MANRS, then they will not emit incorrect routing information to any of their peers, including their transit provider. So that's the first sort of bunch of CDN and clouds that joined the program in March this year, and you see their big names, and we're also grateful for their support. That also raised profile of the MANRS initiative as well. So this is a nice graph that shows how MANRS developed from its inception in 2014, when we launched the network operators with 9 network operators, and now we have almost 400 ISPs, 55 IXPs, and 10 CDN clouds. And last CDN cloud provider joined is VeriSci. Just happened yesterday. So you see, I think the efforts to engage with other groups, not just internet service providers, but other groups like IXPs, like CDNs, it paid off. You can see that the adoption is increasing, and that sort of, this exponential curve that suggests that many more networks will join relatively soon. Well, if you look at sort of, demography of participants, you can see that, and it's interesting that Brazil is leading this chart, and that is due to a very important project that is run by NIC-BR in Brazil, which is called Secure Internet. So they go to network operators, they organize meetings with network operators, and they encourage MANRS adoption, and they encourage signing up for MANRS and implementing those actions. And because of this partnership, and that's exactly what we say, how IXPs can increase MANRS adoption, how we can have those sort of ambassadors to scale this up. Brazil is a very good example here. Because of their project, we have such an influx of members from Brazilian internet community to MANRS. Now, I love this graph. Unfortunately, this is, of course, speculation. That's why I call the impact of efforts like MANRS on routing security, and this is still a question mark, because what is the cause, what's the outcome, is not easy to really prove, right? But again, what I said, I looked at bgpstream.com data, and I calculated number of incidents over time from 2017, and I can see that while the number of MANRS members is increasing, the number of incidents is decreasing. Of course, that might be to other factors, but I would like to believe that MANRS contributes quite a lot to that positive trend. Let me talk a little bit about MANRS capacity building, because one of the things that, although the networks with very experienced personnel that know how to do this stuff, and they implement much more stringent controls that is required by MANRS, there are a lot of networks that probably would like to join MANRS, but have no idea how to implement this stuff. So basically, they put the router standard configuration connected to the upstream, get running, and yeah, the business is going, right? For them, implementing even those simple actions is an investment, right? It's an investment. They need to know how to do that, and that's why in MANRS, to lower the barrier for entry and therefore lower the barrier to improve routing security, we are putting a lot of attention to capacity building, training, information, and so forth. Well, the first thing that we made is work with the community and produced an implementation guide. So if you go to the MANRS website and look at the MANRS actions, for instance, for ISPs, you will see that those are quite high level because they describe the outcomes, right? You should prevent incorrect routing announcements, right? And they're also technology agnostic. They do not say how you should implement that. And that is done on purpose because we want to have those recommendations, being stable over time while technology may change, right? For instance, the global validation doesn't prescribe that you need to register this information in IRR or RPKI because things are changing, right? Like 4 years ago, it was IRR all over the place, and now RPKI is taking off, and more people think, yeah, RPKI is the place where I should register my routes with ROAS. So, but still, if you want to implement those actions, you need to know how. You need to know how for particular technology, and preferably for specific equipment that you're using in your network. So that's why we went off and worked on this implementation guide, which is available on the MANRS website. And it actually was past the best current operational practices task force at RIPE, and is published also as a RIPE document, not the whole guide, but the sort of abstract is published there, so we can reference it as a RIPE document as well. We also did some training tutorials, and that's sort of a very easy and visualized version of the implementation guide with some animations and even quiz that you can check your knowledge against, which are also available online. This is also something that we offer to our partners. So if our partners and for many categories, training is part of the action. You can actually tick one of the MANRS actions if you do training in your community. So we also offer these tutorials that can be used in your training program for your members, for instance, right? And also what we also did, we implemented a virtual lab. It's a web-based lab. And the idea is very simple. So you're given a very simple network with upstream, with peer and customers, and the task is very simple. Please make this network MANRS compliant, right? Implement all MANRS actions for this ISP, this simple ISP. And this is a virtual lab. You can do this on multiple platforms. It's currently supported by Cisco. For Cisco, it's Juniper and MikroTik. And it can be used as a standalone lab or as an end exam. And we are working with some training partners like APNIC, or we're discussing this with RIPE NCC as well. So you can have your own training course, right? Because MANRS is not really, training course on MANRS it doesn't cover many things in BGP or even network security. So courses of network security or courses on BGP engineering, right? Their overlap is MANRS, in fact. So you may have a network security, more comprehensive course, and then say, and as a test, could you please do this lab? And this is an absolutely win-win because participants of the course, they get a completely different setup, right? Simple setup, but you know how it sometimes happens. You go to a training course and you come home and say, okay, well, there is so much knowledge I acquired, but what is the first step I should do in my network? I think this lab, very simple lab, it allows you to test the very simple steps that you can implement right away after coming home. And also it makes your network immediately MANRS compliant, and you can apply and join MANRS. So that is the thinking, and that's also available. When I discussed norms, right? One of the properties of norms, important property, that those norms are visible and measurable, right? So how can you tell if members of MANRS participants are really implementing those actions that they claim they implement, or whether they're just paying lip service and tick those boxes and do not really care? So I have to tell you, and those of you who join MANRS, you know that once you submit an application, we go through the evaluation process and we ask some questions and look at your descriptions, how actions are implemented. But once you join, we don't really have a consistent, or now we have a consistent way of monitoring your level of conformance. But also for you, it's sometimes very useful to see how your network looks from the outside on the compliance front. So to address those problems, 2 years ago, we went off and decided to create what we now call the MANRS Observatory. We decided to develop a tool that will tell our participants about their degree of commitment, and that could be a factual basis of discussion and saying, hey, maybe peer pressure as well, right? But also allow them to look at this and make corrections. In many cases, we saw that people would look at the observatory and say, oh, I didn't realize I'm announcing those bogan routes. So that proves to be true. But also because we're building the tool that can monitor all networks in the internet, all 70,000 networks, not just MANRS participants, it can provide a factual sort of characterize how routing security is developing. So it can be a dashboard of trends as well. Looking at time, how I'm doing. Okay, well, let me go very quickly through the measurement framework. It's on the MANRS Observatory. You can look at this. But basically what we did, we went off and thought of potential metrics that can characterize different actions. Like if you look at action filtering, prevent propagation of routing incidents, what can characterize to what extent you implement this action? And of course, if we see that there are incidents related to a particular network, like route hijacks or leaks, that's clear that this network doesn't implement those controls, and so on and so forth. So MANRS Observatory, well, there are a few screenshots here, but you can log into observatory.manrs.org and look at this for yourself. It's a landing page that shows sort of the state of routing security, but also the state of MANRS readiness. So for each of the action, we calculate a composite metric that says, well, to what extent networks on the internet are ready MANRS. You would be surprised that filtering is 100%, but this is related to the fact that only 2% of networks on the internet in 2019 were a culprit of routing incidents. So that's the caveat, that the drawback of the passive measurements from the outside, because if network didn't create an incident, right, didn't do anything wrong, it doesn't mean that they have controls in place. They might have been just lucky, right? Might be very accurate, but there are no controls. And next time fat fingers happen, the incident will happen, right? That's why I said 2%. It's not the same 2% that goes year and year and year. There are many more that do not have, unfortunately, controls in place. And unfortunately, that's very hard to measure from the outside the network. So you can look also global view. You can hover over the map and get some detailed information about particular countries. Now, for MANRS participants, we offer a more detailed view per network. General public doesn't have the ability to look at the MANRS readiness for a particular network, and that is done for privacy reasons, right? And because we're still improving data quality. So you sometimes need to analyze why this data came this way. But MANRS participants, they have access to this table and to more detailed reports related to their own networks. So they can actually use this to troubleshoot, to improve their MANRS conformance, MANRS readiness, looking at those sort of inconsistencies, and it provides a detailed information. But also it shows to what extent MANRS participants are conformant. And you see they're not all 100%. That's our desired outcome. Some of them are in the red, in fact, and we're working with this members to improve their stance. So to sum up, MANRS is not the solution to routing problem, but that's a very important step, right? It provides a structured, consistent approach to routing security. And we all know security is not a state, it's a process, right? And that's why in corporate security or enterprise security, you know that having those processes, consistent approach, systemic approach to security is very important. If you don't have a patching policy, but you just say, oh, maybe I should patch this application today, you will never be secure because you don't know to what extent you're not patched, to what extent your security level is. But how can you implement the systemic approach in a global decentralized networks with independent networks? So MANRS as a reference point, it offers this opportunity, I think. So it's not a one-stop solution to all the internet routing problems, but it's an important step forward. Why join MANRS? So yeah, the problem that routing security, they're not a very clear business case for many networks, why they should implement controls, why they should improve routing security, especially because this asymmetry, right? Your security in some other hands. But there's still benefits of joining MANRS today. First of all, if you implement those controls, you improve your own security posture and reduce the impact of routing incidents. If you're a transit provider, right? If you provide transit for other customers, those controls, for instance, will prevent that your customer will leak a route and become a transit provider for you, which will be equally devastating, maybe equally devastating for you as for them. You can meet the expectations of the operators community. I think the MANRS, as the adoption goes up, it becomes more and more expected behavior from you. So if you slip your finger and oops, announce an incorrect route, that you will not get a good reputation in the operators community anymore. And still, MANRS is not ubiquitous, right? So you can still use MANRS as a competitive differentiator. You can still say, hey, MANRS is an indicator of security posture of me as a service provider. And that's one of the things that's very important in security, the way to signal to your potential customers your security posture. And MANRS offers you this. So please consider, if you haven't joined this yet, if you have, thank you for your support. But if you haven't, please consider joining us. You can go to the manrs.org website, click on join button. If you're a network operator, you can join as network operator. If you're a cloud provider or a CDN, you can go into this category. You fill out the application form. Please provide as much information as possible. You can actually provide this in your local language, right? Google Translate works well for us, so there is no problem at all. But please describe how you implement this with as much detail as possible. We use this information for our evaluation process, never published unless you want this. And get involved in the community. Contribute, continue contributing to routing security. Be a good network citizen in the internet, and I think we will be all better off. With this, I think that's my last slide, and thank you for your attention. And if there are questions, I think we have maybe some time to talk about them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrei. Very interesting and very, very clear presentation to know what we have to do to be MANRS compliant and to be good citizens in the internet community. Are there any questions from the audience? Let me switch to Spanish. ¿Hay alguna pregunta para Andrei? ¿Queréis que traduzca yo la pregunta si no os atrevéis con el inglés alguien o...? I see there are no questions, Andrei, maybe because it was very clear. I think it was a very, very clear presentation anyway. And well, for those who are just thinking they would like to be in MANRS, but they are like full, their agendas are full and they don't have time to do it. I have heard some people saying, well, I would like to be in MANRS, but I don't have time to do it. What would you say then? What would you tell them then?
Well, I would say, look, I mean, it's of course a matter of discipline, right? I mean, it's a matter of priorities. But I think if you want to play a role in community, that's very important to do. Also, MANRS participation offers you other opportunities. For instance, we launched an MANRS Ambassador Program and MANRS Fellowship Program. So if you're interested in routing security, would like to contribute, consider this. I mean, the fellowship actually doesn't require even MANRS participation, right? And I think it might be close to closing, maybe end of this week, but it will continue later. But more importantly, I think security, if it's an afterthought, if it's put on a back burner, it will fire at you. It will cause you more time and problems. So prevention is much better than mitigation. So please join, please consider. It's not difficult.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrei. And I know it's cold because there are no rounds of applauses when we are remote, but I would like to ask our members to unmute their microphones and do a big round of applause for Andrei now to thank him for being here. It's just like children at school, I do that. Okay, but it's just to thank you. Thank you very much, Andrei.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for your attention and for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. And
Thank you very much.
we will publish your presentation and video. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hope to see you at MANRS.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.